And with that, I am happy to introduce this morning's presenter, Joe Joseph. He is the General Counsel and Senior Executive Vice President of International Trade and Customs and Human Resources at Dalco Resources. So that sounds like an awful lot, Joe. But I'll go ahead and turn it right over to you, Joe, so we can jump right in.
Thanks, Molly. Good morning, folks. Yeah, I appreciate those of you who have logged in, taking time out of your busy day. I know you folks are busy and you have a lot of things on your plate. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time with introductions. I was asked to give this presentation probably about 9 months ago. And as most of you know, a lot of things have changed and things change rather rapidly. So some of the slides in the show, today's presentation may be sort of antiquated because a lot of you have already experienced some of the things we're going to cover. But I'm going to move rapidly through the first probably half of this because a lot of what I'm going to cover initially is trying to grasp an understanding of how we got to where we're at today. And I think it's important that we grasp some understanding because I think it'll help you going forward and how you choose to navigate your particular supply chain. That being said, I'm going to move to the next slide. It's basically a little bit about me and who I am. I am legal counsel for a local 3PL. I am also a United States Customs broker. I'm also the Executive Vice President of their international business. I was, prior to that, in private practice and basically counseling a lot of companies with regard to international supply chains and international business and law. As the slide shows, I do quite a bit of traveling. I've been to approximately 39 countries. And I've been involved in basically the international supply chain side of things for, well, it's been close to 30 years now. I've indicated to Molly a couple of things, the first of which is this slideshow will be available for you folks if you want to send an email, and I'll give you all this information at the end. If you want to send me an email or Molly an email, I'll be glad to forward this PowerPoint presentation on to whoever's interested in reviewing it. Second thing is at the end, we are going to allow for questions for those of you who are interested in asking. I'm willing to stay on a little bit longer. If you have a specific question about your particular situation, I'll be glad to address it. I'm also going to provide you my email and phone number. You're free to call me or email me with any questions or concerns that you might have, and I'll be glad to address those with you. That being said, basically, over the last couple of years, most of you have been basically trying to absorb the tumultuous supply chain situation that we're all stuck in. Some of you are basically riding the wave, hoping this goes away soon, or you're just kind of going with the flow. Some of you are more active and what I say sort of managing the storm. How you approach it is basically a personal decision, and it may be impacting the end result. Today, this is kind of a general overview of the 4 areas that we're going to cover: the global supply chain, its collapse and how we got to where we are, COVID and the global supply chain, what the current status of things are, is it irretrievably or irreparably broken, and how do we escape the supply chain paradigm and perhaps take a different approach, may offer some solutions, or at least an opportunity to better manage your current supply chain and maybe be able to manage your costs a little bit better. Preliminarily, I think there's a couple of things that we need to wrap our head around. The first of which is, prior to COVID setting in, and despite what some may think or you've been told or read or saw, COVID did not cause the current supply chain crisis. It certainly was a catalyst in bringing it about, but it was not the cause. What the end result of the collapse in our supply chain we're seeing today began long before COVID set in. Prior to COVID, the top 10 ocean liners in the world consumed 85% of the market. The next screen here, you can see the names of those that most of you are familiar with. Began this creation of three alliances. In mid-2018, all of these ocean carriers got together and began to form what is now known as these three alliances that control 85% of the capacity of the container ship fleet and even a higher percentage of the line haul capacity. Those three alliances deploy 3,100 vessels, which is a majority of the vessels currently in service. Now, what does that mean? Historically, these ships were basically their own independent operating fleets. When they created these three alliances, the ships within those alliances agreed that they would not compete with each other in certain lanes and in certain ports. So the purpose of all this, we were sold by the ocean carriers at the time, was to create carrier capacity management. But what the reality of it was they were managing and manipulating the capacity in certain trade lanes. For example, one of the biggest trade lanes, or the most busiest trade lanes, obviously, is the Shanghai to LA trade lane. And hypothetically speaking, Maersk agreed with MSC that Maersk would not ship in that lane if MSC agreed not to ship in a lane from Korea to LA. So they began to manipulate capacity both via container and ocean vessel in order to strengthen their pricing. They began to blank sailings, and everybody's had this experience in the past where ocean carriers canceled sailings. They took their ships out of service, and it began to impact pricing. This is pre-COVID. This is in late 2018 and early 2019. Prior to the pandemic, in addition to the ocean alliances, the Chinese economy began to slow down. And we saw rising wages in China. They began to experience a massive debt crisis, which they're still under. We saw the 232 and 301 tariffs and trade wars began. That was the imposition of those 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel products. And there was a lot of political unrest going on around the region. If you recall, they were having issues with Hong Kong and still continue now with Taiwan. We then have COVID set in. And if you recall, in January and February of 2020, China was experiencing the COVID outbreaks prior to the US. We had the alliances issuing blank sailings. We also had, and most of you may be familiar with this, China has the Chinese New Year holiday that sets in usually around mid to late January and continues into February, where most of the labor force leaves the manufacturing cities and goes home to their outlying origin villages. And we usually see when the folks leave those facilities and go home and come back, traditionally we would see a loss of about 20% of the labor force there. Well, COVID is setting in China. When the Chinese holiday ended in 2020, there was an even greater reduction in the labor force returning back from the China manufacturing facilities. We began to see GRIs, or general rate increases, being imposed by the ocean carriers. At that time, in early February, of 2020, an eastbound rate going from Shanghai to LA was approximately $1,100 to $1,400 per 40-foot unit. Westbound going the other way from LA to Shanghai was about $750 per unit. In February, early March, China was reporting about 240,000 businesses had shut down. Their economy was shrinking by double digits. And in the US, this was having an impact on our economy as we were beginning to see an immediate impact to access of finished goods. The manufacturing side was having difficulty getting components and parts. It was due in part to not so much the ocean carriers' reduction in sailings, but a lot of it had to do with a reduction in labor force, particularly in the Pacific Rim. We began to see inventory shortages. I hate to bring it up, but we began to see, if you recall, the issue with disposable tissue papers and the Clorox wipes and things like that. We began to see a lot of inventory shortages in the grocery stores, and in the manufacturing sector, we began to see a lot of shortages with raw materials. The price of goods began to destabilize, and we began to see a lot of impact at the ports on the ability to adequately resource the labor side of the port areas. What was also occurring, and this is extremely important, kind of grasp a container capacity imbalance was already in play. What was happening in the Pacific Rim, which happens every year during the peak retail season, which usually begins in September, a lot of the ocean carriers and owners of containers begin to reposition a lot of that equipment into the Pacific Rim because a lot of the material coming out of China is going eastbound into the US to ramp up for the Christmas season. So we normally see significant container imbalances, and then COVID made that even worse for a couple of reasons. The first of which is, if you see on the slide with regard to new builds, containers are required to meet certain shipping standards. And roughly there's about 500,000 containers a year taken out of service because they don't meet the required ISO standards that a container must meet in order to get onto a ship. Those 500,000 that are taken out of service are usually replaced by new builds. But because of COVID, the lack of labor in China, those 500,000 new builds were not happening. We saw about 1 million container deficit occur because of the lack of equipment. On that slide, you'll see this is somewhat alarming that 80% of the new containers are manufactured by 3 companies in China. So as China was experiencing a significant labor issue due to COVID, those containers just weren't getting manufactured. When they began to emerge out of COVID, the 3 manufacturing companies in China decided they still weren't going to begin ramping up to build new containers because they liked the pricing they were getting for the ones that they had in service and the ones that they were building. That resulted in significant container imbalances because it was creating shortages in some of the most needed areas of where equipment usually or traditionally is positioned. Those container shortages had an immediate impact on our economy and on the US. The empty container math just wasn't adding up for us. We had a lot of empty containers piling up at ports because of the blank sailings. As you recall, the ocean carriers were manipulating capacity and they were allowing containers to pile up. One of those areas, for example, was in Shanghai, where containers were just sitting on the docks and not being repositioned to places like the US. So if you were exporting, you were being told there was not equipment that was available, or that you couldn't get space on a ship. Part of it was due to the lack of equipment, mainly those containers that were not in the US. In April of 2020, those ocean carriers that I referred to within those alliances began to use sweeper ships to reposition equipment and containers to Asia. They began to take containers out of places like South Korea, Taiwan, the South Pacific, and also the US. A lot of our equipment was taken out of the US and repositioned back to China as they began to reopen, and our economy was slowing down and actually closing at one point. This point here with regard to the empty containers in Los Angeles, the empties sitting at the port in China, in LA rather, have increased by over 20% and almost 50% in Chicago. Why is that important? A lot of those empty containers are being pulled out of the US, being sent back to China because of the rates that were being charged. As the rates began for containers to increase at a very rapid pace, those sweeper ships were deadheading those empties back to China so they could fill them and bring them back to the US because they were getting much higher rates. It was more profitable for them to bring back empties to China than to wait for them to fill in the US. Just to put things in perspective, prior to the 2019-2020 supply chain initiation of its current crisis, we were importing about 6 containers to an export of 1. That rapidly rose in about April 2020 to a 13-to-1 imbalance, 13 going out to 1 coming in. A lot of this was occurring because of the money. The ocean carriers were able to make more money shipping empties back to Asia. So where are we now? Obviously, for those who are importing or exporting or doing both, we continue to have capacity and equipment constraints due to supply chain disruptions, due to container imbalances. Most of the US small to medium-sized businesses importing continue to report supply chain disruptions. You're all experiencing high transportation costs and terrible service. I was reading a statistic the other day. Service levels have gone down significantly. They're at all-time record lows, and that's going to become important as we move on. Keep that in the back of your mind. Eastbound rates, that Shanghai to LA rate, has rose almost 400% just this year. In 2021, just this year from January to date, we've seen 22 rate increases, and that's unprecedented. We've never had that before. This slide here, we tend to track the spot market rate. I like to collect a lot of data. It's how I do a lot of the predicting where we're going, and it allows me to help my customers manage their costs as we track where the container rates are going and where they've been. If you see on the left there, this is the westbound going from the US to China rates. You can see from August until July of this year, you can see the rates outbound going from roughly $2,500 to $6,900 per container unit. On the right-hand side is an index that we track. This is Shanghai to LA, and you can see just from roughly September of 2021 until October of this year, container rates coming in this direction were in the $4,000 range, now exceeding the $12,000 per container range. So you can see where things have trended, and the ocean containers or ocean carriers basically controlling these spot market rates. Just to clarify, spot market versus contract rates. Contract rates are afforded to some of the larger carriers, for example, a Walmart, where every year they negotiate a flat contract rate with ocean carriers. They do about 1 million containers a year into LA Long Beach from China. So they have a little bit of negotiating power versus some of the smaller below 5,000 containers. And that number is even shrinking, where ocean carriers will not offer contract rates. So those that are small, can't get that contract rate, tend to have to rely on the spot market, which is the open market. Part of what is driving this rate, that market rate, is generally speaking, when you go to book your freight, the rate that's available at the time is the rate that you're getting. And the ocean carriers, depending on the capacity and how much space they have on the ship, drives that cost. It's simply supply and demand. What happened, particularly after the Chinese New Year of this year, the Walmarts of the world were consuming all of their contract rate in order to move their freight, but they entered the spot market rate themselves and began to bid on those spot market rates themselves. Some of the larger customers that I know firsthand that I'm involved with basically came to me and said, offer this price, we need to get those containers on that ship. So we were able to go back to the ocean carriers, and at the time, the market rate may have been $6,000. Some of the larger customers were willing to pay double that price just to get on, which caused an immediate spike in the rates. And they continued to go on, and the more the rates went up and the more the capacity on the spot market rate was shrinking, the bigger people on the block began to offer more and more money to get their containers on those ships. This slide that you're looking at here is just simply an example from November to December. In that roughly 2-week period, you can see where rates have gone. And you can see just this year's annual percentage of change in some of those rates. One I was referring to is this Los Angeles to Shanghai rate. You can see it's up 153%. And you can see some of the pricing where it's gone just in the 2-week period there. Interesting slide. I stuck this in here because I think it puts things into perspective. This is CMA CMG's recorded third quarter profits. I'm just going to touch on 2 things. The first of which is you can see their earnings before interest and taxes in US dollars just in the third quarter was over $6 billion in the third quarter, up 356%. The most telling thing about this particular slide is the change in volume. Their volume's down 2.5%, but their profits are up 356% just in that quarter. Now, looking at this particular slide, you say, well, the volume is down. That's not all that piece of information tells us. What that's telling us there isn't because CMA just doesn't want to ship more containers. That's indicative of that container imbalance and lack of equipment number. Even the ocean carriers are having difficulty acquiring enough equipment to move the containers, because by no means would CMA say, I'm going to move less freight for more money. They just can't get their hands on equipment, just like you and I have difficulty at times getting our hands on equipment. This is what the Pacific Rim looks like right now. I know a lot of you have seen on the news, all of this information about how many ships are off the coast, the west coast of the U.S. I just thought some of you folks would like to actually see what's going on in the Pacific Rim. If you look to the far right, that's the west coast where you see a lot of those green dots. What did that last slide basically translate to? I'll explain this to you. So when you watch the news and you hear all this reporting on how many ships are waiting to berth off the west coast, there's actually about 96 ships currently waiting to berth. That's about a month's worth of material floating around the Pacific Rim. You are going to hear that is down to about 40 ships, and all that has occurred is more for ops than it is for practical presentation. Is they're not counting the ships that are beyond 20 miles. They basically have just about 3 weeks ago decided that the reporting is going to be based on a different queue. Instead of being 96 ships waiting to berth, it's 40 ships because there's only 40 ships that are within 20 miles of the port. The other ships are basically bobbing around the Pacific. They've been pushed out further under the guise that it's for safety reasons. There are about 127 ships total. Of the 96, there's waiting to berth. There are some ships that have berth waiting to offload, roughly 31 of those waiting to offload at the port, at a West Coast port, mainly LA Long Beach. So the question is whether or not the global supply chain, is it irretrievably or irreparably broken? Folks understand that it is so fragile at this point that even the smallest of interruptions result in a substantial reverberation across the entire supply chain. It's sort of like the proverbial drop a pebble in a still lake and watch even the smallest of pebbles create the biggest of ripples. That's what the supply chain is like. One of the best examples I can give is the ship that wrecked or went aground in the Suez Canal, created tremendous amount of problems around the global supply chain. The continued issues with regard to COVID and the variants that keep popping up, and the reaction around the globe to those variants is having a significant impact on the supply chain. And the interruptions, obviously, we can't control. The reverberation we can't control. Just be aware that even the smallest of wrinkles is creating the greatest of challenges. Ocean carriers are still refusing U.S. exports or refusing to provide adequate equipment. For those of you who are experiencing problems on the export side, I want to caution you that the FMC, the Federal Maritime Commission, finally got involved and is threatening to fine ocean carriers if they're not making adequate exports available to U.S. exporters. So, of course, the ocean carriers who are making record profits this year are playing the game where now they'll accept your booking. You are ramping up to export your material, and when you go to pick up your equipment, just for some odd reason, your dray carrier goes to the container yard to pick up your 40-foot container, and just by some unusual circumstance, there are no 40-foot containers available. So that's the game the ocean carriers are paying. I just caution you that when you are booking an export, just because you're getting a confirmed booking doesn't mean that the ocean carrier is going to move your freight. The FMC is finally getting involved, assessing whether the container lines are abusing their market power. Peak season shipping is ongoing. Inventory sales to numbers are still out of sync. We always measure from a data standpoint where our inventory to sales ratios are. The sales are still outpacing the inventory, which is creating a supply-demand issue. Equipment imbalances continue. There's still a lack of chassis at a lot of the ports. We obviously know that U.S. trucking is still an issue within the U.S. We're down roughly 80,000 trucks from where we were about 3 years ago. Some of that's self-inflicted through some of the legislation that was passed, and some of the states, like the state of California, has made some of the carriage within the state or crossing through the state very difficult for some of the carriers. Most important thing, rate increases are continuing. We have seen some carriers flatten out their rates, but there are some that are still rate increasing and creating economic hardships. Our current crisis, understand folks, having traveled the world. I will say this emphatically, the US domestic infrastructure is one of the most antiquated and just unable to handle the demand of the cargo coming in. The UP Rail, for example, suspended at one point shipping eastbound freight from the West Coast, so that folks understand you're bringing containers in to the port of LA Long Beach, maybe destined, say, for Cleveland, Ohio. The material generally would transit from the port of LA Long Beach to, say, Chicago, then on to Cleveland via rail. That rail piece is part of your ocean cost. But the ocean carrier doesn't control the rail, they simply bought the tariff. What ended up happening was, because of the lack of space and capacity in Chicago, for example, the UP Rail just quit shipping your containers from the West Coast to Chicago. Obviously, in response to that, a lot of people said, well, I'll just ship to LA, which created more problems because it just sort of transitioned the congestion from Chicago to LA. Ocean carriers are skipping calls to a lot of ports, something that's important. A lot of folks may be shipping out of that Pacific Rim from China, say, to the West Coast. There are other folks that are trying to move material, say, out of Taiwan and South Korea. Generally, what was happening before 2020, a lot of those ships were reserving some of their capacity coming out of China, would call to Busan, Korea, for example, finish loading that ship onto the West Coast. Well, because these ships were filling in China, they were just bypassing Busan, Korea, which was reducing the capacity there, which was delaying a lot of the movement of the cargo from China to the US and from Busan, Korea, say, for example, into the US. The container shortages and the imbalances are really devastating the global supply chain. It is not just unique to the US. There are tremendous issues in the European market right now as a result of the container imbalances and shortages. COVID-19 a couple of months ago caused significant shutdowns of a lot of the South China ports and a lot of the Indian factories, which also compounded the problem, because when they reopened back up, there was a significant demand for equipment and for capacity. We're experiencing another outbreak, and I think we're going to continue to experience issues with regard to outbreaks around the globe, which is reverberating throughout the supply chain. We're still in the peak season shipping season, even though we are a couple of weeks out from Christmas. It usually had subsided mid-November, but because of the disruptions in the supply chain, we're still kind of in the thralls of it. We're still trying to get a lot of that material that the retailers ordered onto their shelves, which some of it is still stuck out to sea or stuck at some of the ports. We are now beginning to also ramp up for the inventory ramp ups for the Chinese New Year, which is beginning, I believe, January 31st this year, and will continue, I believe, till about mid-February. So what's coming next? In the short term, we're going to continue to see rate increases. We're going to continue to see canceled sailings, and we are going to continue to see a decline in service due to overbookings. In the long term, I say this tongue in cheek, there may be some light at the end of the tunnel. We are beginning to see more active collaboration between public and private sectors. Our government has been working, for example, with some of the bigger shippers, like the Walmarts, who are repositioning some of their material off the port of LA Long Beach to create more space and capacity, which isn't a long-term fix, but it's at least an indication that the problem is being recognized and we're trying to get it resolved. The FMC, finally, our Federal Maritime Commission, is taking a more active role in improving port conditions. Prior to January of 2021, this year, they took a hands-off approach and basically had hoped that the market would work itself out through supply and demand, and it, as we can see, got just progressively worse instead of getting better. So hopefully those two things in the long term will help ease some of the problems we're having. So what can be done? Take some time here. I kind of ran through those other slides, so I'm going to slow down here a little bit and discuss some of the things of what can be done. I think first and foremost, I will say this when I do these presentations, and I'll use the word normal, the days of normalcy are gone. The way things happened 2 years ago or a year ago are long gone and will never return to normal. The ocean carriers will never return to old pricing for those who are holding out hope that their costs will normalize, going to pre-pandemic levels. That's just not going to happen. And the container imbalances, I believe, are going to continue going forward because of the lack of manufacturing of new containers and the ability of the ocean containers and carriers to manipulate capacity. That being said, I think that you have to break out of the prior paradigm of what you knew about global supply chain. A lot of folks, and I'm sure there are many of you out there who have been doing this a long time, were accustomed to basically getting onto an online portal, booking your container, and your container moved from point A to point B, and you really didn't pay much attention to it. A lot of you depend on your supplier overseas to ship your freight. We're going to talk about that. It's something that you really need to take a look at. But first and foremost, short term in the immediate, I think to resolve or at least address some of the issues that you're experiencing, you've got to become agile. And what I mean by that is you've got to be maybe receptive to doing things a little bit differently than you did before. The first of which is when we began to predict what were now occurring, saying my company began to look at possibly altering destination ports for our customers. For example, we began to reposition a lot of our cargo away from the West Coast and utilizing other ports that were regionally and geographically functional for our particular customers. And I want to stress that because I've highlighted there that we need to be careful. I can't tell you how many times I've had customers call and say, you know, we were having all of these problems with our supply chain. There were so many delays, prices were going up, that our shipper overseas told us they could get it to the US much cheaper, much faster than we could. So we allowed our supplier to ship our material. I will caution you because most of the dealings I've had with overseas suppliers, they're limited in their knowledge of two things. The first of which is internally, how our supply chain functions compared to theirs. They assume that our internal domestic carriage is similar to theirs, and in most countries it is not. The second thing is they're not aware of ports that we may be aware of here that may function much better than where they want to send it. I'll give you an example, and I don't mean to offend anybody by saying this. A lot of the suppliers overseas know basically two ports. I'm sending it to New York, I'm sending it to LA. Oh, I heard that Savannah may be an option now too. Well, as you can see, LA is really not an option. It may be cheaper to get your material into the port of LA than to say, get it to Chicago. But that's just not the case from your end use perspective. It's not faster once it hits the port of LA Long Beach because your material could be bobbing off the Pacific for a month. And then it berths, and then you've got to get it to its end user, which if you're, say, in the Akron, Canton, Cleveland, Youngstown, Erie area and that material came into the Port of LA Long Beach, a lot of overseas suppliers just think you can stick the container on a truck and drive it across the country, unload it, and send the container back. That's not the way our supply chain works. No dray carrier is bringing your container from LA to Erie, for example. They are not going to put that container on a chassis and drive it across the country. So what that means is it has to be transloaded, which now exposes your cargo to damage by the CFS or transloading facility, and then it has to be loaded onto a truck and trucked across the US. I can assure you the cost of putting your material on a flatbed truck or in a box truck from LA to Erie is going to cost you more than the rail piece would have cost you if your supplier would have just railed it to Chicago or brought it into an alternative port where we could have transloaded and trucked it. So be careful when you're trying to locate a different port, how it's going to function for you. But alternate destination ports should never be taken off the table and should always be a consideration. Consider new lanes. For example, instead of shipping your material into the West Coast, you may try an East Coast port. It's a longer sail time, say from the Pacific Rim into the East Coast, but it may alleviate you in the long run of having to wait months for your material to get offloaded. Consider methods of shipping. This may not make a lot of sense to some people, but it depends on how you're attacking your supply chain issues. LCL freight, less than full container loads, move much faster right now into some ports than full container loads. Why is that? The example I gave you, bringing it into the West Coast, let's say hypothetically you ask me, I want to bring this into the West Coast. I have a full container I want to bring in. My question is, how urgent is it that you get the entire container? Well, can you get by with, say, half of that container? Possibly. Let's LCL it to, say, Portland. I can pick it up there with an LTL carrier. It's about a 13-day sail time. They're not as congested as LA Long Beach. I can get your material here in roughly 30 days, as long as it's not a full container, because I'm going to send it to a CFS station, pick it up there, truck it via traditional FedEx LTL carrier. A strategy that we've been employing, not necessarily in that model or in that example, but maybe sending partial freight to other ports where we can pick it up in our internal domestic infrastructure, and our rates with our carriers and how we're moving the freight allows us to do it much more faster and possibly much more efficient. A lot of people say, well, my landed cost, my costs go up because my per pound charge, I'm paying more. Not necessarily. It's something that needs to be drilled down into in your specific case to see if in fact it's that much more expensive to send partials than a full container. And it's all going to depend on how you're measuring your landed costs and where you're sending your freight to. So that's also a possibility that should be looked at in terms of how you're going to manage your cost and manage your supply chain. Number 4, are you taking advantage of foreign trade zones, your temporary imports, and your imports for export? A lot of folks don't realize that when you're bringing material in, whether it's raw material, partially built material, that you're going to incorporate into a project or you're going to incorporate into a piece of equipment or machinery for export, you have an opportunity to avoid paying duties and avoid having to pay some of the costs that you're paying to bring your material in, which could substantially reduce your landed cost. For example, we have a customer who brings in titanium tubes, for example, from China that are incorporated into a particular system, and then they export that material out to other parts of the world. Those tubes coming in from China, which would otherwise be subject to a 25% tariff, come in duty-free as long as we get them out within the time constraints that customs provides for, and they avoid that 25% cost, and it substantially reduces the cost of their finished product. Going forward, one of the things that I think, or one of the most important things for maybe today's takeaway, is the importance of building relationships with the person or persons or entity that's moving your freight. I can't underscore this more than saying this might be the single most important way for you to manage your supply chain. I have some questions there. How often do you meet with your providers to discuss your supply chain? People do make a difference when you have issues, when your costs are spiraling out of control, when your customers are demanding material, when you're experiencing line shutdowns. Are you able to call somebody, get a voice on the phone and say, hey, we need to re-strategize, or we need to take another look at what we're doing because what we're doing isn't working? How much access do you have to all of your providers' resources and ingenuity? There's a lot that goes into how we move our freight. There's a lot of accumulation of data. There's a lot of accumulation of scorecarding from our end, for example, where we will suggest, for example, how your freight should move, some of the ports that are functioning well within the lanes that you're moving, and some that aren't functioning well that you need to avoid. Some of the domestic internal costs that you could manage maybe a little bit better, and things like that, where you're now getting the full resources and ingenuity of your provider. Do you include your provider at the initial stages of new projects? I can't, again, underscore this more. A lot of the countries I've traveled to have been with customers who are sourcing material from other places where we are part of the formulation of their sourcing, because we sit at the table with them and basically offer suggestions on who's managing their freight, which Incoterms they're going to ship under, who's going to handle what stage of the transportation in the course of the supply chain. So most of you know, when you're importing or exporting containers, there's roughly 3 to 5 legs of that, and all of those need to be addressed. There are legal constraints to where you're exporting to or where you're importing from. That's a benefit, for example, that we can offer because of the resources that we have. So there's a lot that goes into that. And you need to, back in the old days, hey, we just basically got online. We were able to log in, move our freight from point A to point B. We would book a container on an online portal, and sometimes it would show up on time. Sometimes it wouldn't, but it generally got there. Can't do that anymore. You need to make sure that your provider is involved at the initial stages of your new projects or your new sourcing so that they can help you manage your costs. Because once you're locked into a contract, I hear this more times than not, well, my supply contract says FOB Port of LA Long Beach. I actually reviewed a contract for a customer that showed up at our door and said, their contract said FOB any port in the US. So the suppliers were just basically dumping their freight wherever they could get capacity and wherever they could get a sailing booked. And it was coming in all over the country. And I said, you need to go back to your supplier. The supplier pushed back and said, that's what the contract says. So you've got to live with whatever we're doing. You want to avoid surprises. Within every supply chain, there are always inherent problems. They exist for everybody, regardless of the circumstance. The most important thing is you can't wait until they mushroom into something worse. I always use the cliche, you never have a problem until you have a problem. So be careful. You don't want to incur a surprise when your cargo's bobbing around in the ocean somewhere, or it's stuck at a foreign port and you can't get it moving. Audits, another important thing. How often do you bring somebody in to audit your freight? Most companies audit your freight for free. They don't charge you to come in, take a look at what you're doing. And if anything, it gives you a firmer understanding of actually how your supply chain is working. There may be something in there that you can't see or don't see that they can point out, or they may be able to offer suggestions on how to reduce your current freight costs. It also helps you develop the right approach in terms of crafting a budget. matching shipping volumes to forecasted rates. Again, forecasting is an important thing. It may offer you an opportunity as you go forward, maybe into this new year when you're putting your budgets together on what you can anticipate your landed costs might be. Freight audits usually develop simplified ongoing flows of accurate information, particularly to senior management. The end result is a report. The data should go to maybe that C-level person who would otherwise maybe not be paying attention to your supply chain. You know, it's usually, hey, just make sure the freight gets from point A to point B so we don't have a line shut down. Well, now it allows a snapshot of what's going on. So maybe those upper level management people can see some of the problems that you folks, if you're moving or responsible for moving your freight, are experiencing. It helps avoid diseconomies of scale within your supply chain. And I use the word diseconomy sort of generically. Within the supply chain, you may have a blip within there that's really turning your costs upside down. It may just be a partial problem within your supply chain as opposed to the entire setup of your supply chain, which is causing the input to be more expensive or unusually more expensive than what you anticipated. That being said, certainly I know we have about 5 or 6 minutes available or amenable to answering any questions. I'll come back to this slide. On this last slide, I'm giving you my contact information. For those who have questions or you have an afterthought, you can certainly email me at that address or call me at that number. I'll be happy to forward this slideshow presentation on to you if you're interested in reviewing it at your leisure. Or if you want to call me, contact me just because you have a specific question about your particular situation or just in general. I'm always happy to answer the email or take the phone call and discuss more specifics. I gave you kind of a mile-high look down on some things here. Certainly it needs, in your specific instance, a little more drilled down attention, but I'm certainly available to answer any questions you folks might have.
Great, thank you, Joe. That was a lot of information, very helpful. I will open it up for questions. You can use the Q&A box or the chat box, or if your question is easier to ask without typing, you can go ahead and raise your hand and I can unmute you to allow you to speak. So that is an option as well. But we don't currently have any questions in here. So we'll give it a minute if anyone has any. Joe, while we're waiting to see if there's any questions, any final thoughts that you'd like to put out there?
I would just say if the folks are still tuned in here, again, anticipate that things are not going to change anytime soon. I do expect a little bit of leveling off in March of 2022 with regard to pricing, not seeing as many rate increases, but certainly not rate reductions going forward. But there are a lot of options, I think, for specific entities to manage their costs so they're not subjected to these massive fluctuations in rates. It just takes a little bit of time to step back. I will say this, folks, and I don't know who's listening in. Supply chains can no longer be mashed into your budgeting as basically a cost of production or a cost of sales. It requires a separate line item budget. I think it needs to be addressed and at least paid attention to at the ownership or C-level or board of director level, depending on the size of your entity, for consideration. It is something that has become so fragile that it really impacts first the bottom line of every company, but second of all, the ability to function the way the company wants to function and to be seamless and be able to provide, a quality product and provide excellent customer service. we've all experienced the headaches, the customer screaming about, where's my material? Why hasn't your product been sent? And you try and explain to them, well, we're still waiting on our materials from overseas. As we know, most customers don't care. They just want their product as bad as we want ours. So I do think that building the relationships and undergoing the audits right now are extremely important to try and getting these things under control.
Great, thank you. We did have a question come in. Deb asked, how easy is it to get an FTZ established? And then also she missed what T&E stood for. If you could clarify that for her, please.
Yeah, the T&E is transport for immediate export. So let's say you're bringing in a full container, and some of that material may be staying at your facility. Some of that material may be leaving the country. You're going to just bring it in because you sourced it from, again, I'll use China, but it's bound for Mexico. It was more conducive or cheaper or efficient for you to bring it into your facility, and part of that going out to Mexico. Part of that material can be imported for immediate export to Mexico and be excluded from your duties. So you may only have to pay duties on a partial piece of that material coming in. It's a transport for immediate export, meaning it has to come in and go out. So you can bring it into your facility, unpack the container, put it on a truck, and get it out of the country. Now, with respect to foreign trade zones, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. Long and short is this, and I'll use, say, Northeastern Ohio. The Port of Cleveland is in a foreign trade zone. If you're within the radius of that foreign trade zone, your company, you can set up your own sub-foreign trade zone. And therefore, you are now qualified to operate as a foreign trade zone. It takes some time. Customs has to approve it. It's probably about a 4 to 6 month process, and there is some expense incurred in it. But if it's something that you're going to bring material into the country on a routine basis, further work it, machine it, incorporate it into another product, and export it, it's worth the investment and the time to do it, because once you have it set up, it's forever set up as long as you're in compliance. There's some accounting functions that need to be set up for auditing purposes by customs, but it's worth your while if you're importing and exporting material. I hope I answered a question or your question. So
I think so. We'll put it out to Deb. If that did not answer your question, please let us know. While you were speaking, Joe, I got an email from one of the participants who you mentioned, Savannah, and she was there over the weekend, and she sent me a couple of photos of a ship going through, and it had over 2,000 containers on it. It's just packed to the gills. So just bringing it home that, we are out there seeing this stuff in the real world. So
if I can, let me comment on the Port of Savannah. I'll nip this in the bud right now. First and foremost, Savannah is not an option right now for anybody. If you're being told that, you're being sold a bill of goods. If you're being told that they have the capacity, they do not have the capacity. Plus, there is not a lot of inward U.S. service out of Savannah going to other parts of the country. Meaning once the material gets to Savannah, if you can get it off a boat, you've got to get it anywhere else. It's very difficult right now to get material out of the Port of Savannah off to the end user. Plus, they have the time constraints and the ships bobbing off the coast, just like LA Long Beach. You just don't hear about it in the news as much, maybe on a smaller scale because the port is smaller. But the other thing too, I'm getting a lot of phone calls. They hear people on TV saying, send your freight to Florida. Do not send it to Florida. We have containers that have been sitting at the Port of Miami at the East Coast Rail Yard. They've been there for months because they don't have the ability to move the containers. So don't fall into that trap either.
Thank you. And Deb did comment that you did answer her question. So thank you for that. Okay, well, we are at 9:30. Certainly, if anybody has any questions, we don't want to cut this short, but we do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I don't see any other questions coming in. As Joe has said, feel free to reach out to Joe or myself with any questions that may come up. We will have this recording available to send out, and Joe has mentioned he will share the presentation if you'd like. So just reach out to us. We're here to help. And just want to thank Joe again for all of this information. I know I appreciate it. I believe everyone on appreciates it as well. Thank you to everyone who logged on and listened to us. We certainly appreciate that and hope to see everyone again soon, whether it's virtual or in person, and happy holidays to everybody.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, folks.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.